Good evening. Welcome to the seventh in the Spring Faculty Lecture Series, The Worlds of William Shakespeare. Our subject tonight, medical practice and practitioners in Shakespeare's day. Our speaker is Professor of Medical History in the School of Medicine here at UCLA. During 1959, he was Special Lecturer in the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of London. He is an honorary fellow of the Faculty of the History of Medicine, of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in London, fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, effective member of the International Academy of the History of Medicine and of the International Academy of the History of Sciences, and is a corresponding member of learned societies in Sweden, Germany, and Spain. He is the author and co-author of numerous books on the history of anatomy and medicine during the Renaissance, the most recent of which, just published, is his work on the great anatomist Andreas Vesalius of Brussels. It is with considerable pleasure that I present to you Professor C.D. O'Malley. Charles.
Professor Frankel, ladies and gentlemen. Although the birth of William Shakespeare in April 1564 was a matter of sufficient significance to us so that we are celebrating that event 400 years later, for other reasons it was also of great significance to his parents, John and Mary Shakespeare. First of all, both mother and son survived the birth, despite the ministrations of a midwife who very likely was an illiterate woman with some empirically acquired knowledge of normal birth, but who was wholly unprepared to deal with complications should they arise, and of course totally ignorant of the meaning of sepsis. If the midwife who assisted at William's birth resembled others, even though she had been licensed by the bishop of the diocese, she was prone to such superstitions as covering the windows to prevent the entrance of evil spirits and demanding that all the locks and bolts of the house be unfastened to ease the mother's ordeal. It was not enough, however, that William was safely born, for he must survive the many possibilities of death, such as those that had already carried off his two sisters. It is true that he avoided the two bad plague years of 1562 and 1563, as well as the severe epidemic of smallpox in the latter year, which had even dared to attack the new Queen Elizabeth. On the other hand, a local epidemic of plague struck Stratford in 1564, just 3 months after young William was born, and claimed 250 lives. It was a risky situation that he faced, threatened by plague, smallpox, measles, malaria, rickets, whooping cough, or chin cough as it was then called, and a great many other ailments, many of them not yet differentiated, but lumped under the term fevers. It was always remarkable at that time that any child survived birth and infancy, and the fact that this particular one lived on for 52 years meant that he succeeded in reaching what was then old age, a feat owing probably more to luck and native constitution than to the assistance of the medical profession. Not that William Shakespeare did not hold that profession in the highest esteem. In fact, his daughter, Susanna, married a physician in 1607, John Hall, sometimes said to have been a graduate of Oxford, but actually small commendation from our point of view, since the university's medical curriculum at that time was far from satisfactory. Although Hall was not an MD and had no association with the powerful College of Physicians of London, he was esteemed locally and appears to have been the favourite physician of the gentry in the neighbourhood of Warwick, although more likely for his manner and presence rather than for any unusual medical ability. In England, one could study medicine at Oxford or Cambridge and in due course become a Bachelor of Medicine or, after an additional period of time, a Doctor of Medicine. The curriculum was hopelessly medieval, however, and in consequence, a few students with means and initiative went to the much better medical school of the University of Padua, Nursery of the Arts, as William Shakespeare was later to call it, or to Bologna, or Montpellier, or Paris. Despite their better training, upon returning to England, such graduates of foreign medical schools could not practice medicine until they had succeeded in obtaining a license, whereas the more poorly trained Oxford and Cambridge graduates faced no such restriction. This was in accordance with the Medical Act of 1511, which had placed the licensing power in the hands of the bishops, who usually granted licenses after consultation with a panel of physicians, although not required to seek such assistance, and sometimes they did not. The situation became somewhat different in London, where, although the bishop and also the dean of St. Paul's might license, in 1518, Thomas Linacre, physician to Henry VIII, succeeded in persuading his monarch to permit the establishment of a college of physicians with power to license in London and for 7 miles around. This was the organization, first meeting in Dr. Linacre's home on Knight Rider Street, and then during the period we are concerned with at Amon Corner, that Shakespeare referred to as the Congregated College. Still later, in some manner now unknown, it came to be called the Royal College of Physicians of London, of which the fellowship is today the highest honour in British medicine. And finally, after various translations from one part of London to another, this college has, in the last several months, taken over new and splendid quarters in Regent's Park. The object of these licensing regulations was, of course, to prevent the practice of a variety of quacks and charlatans, who, however, seem never to have been satisfactorily suppressed during the period with which we are concerned. One reason for this condition was actually a fault of the physicians themselves, who, few in number, tended to devote their efforts lucratively to those of wealth and position, but at the same time sought to deny to all others the right to care for the great mass of the people. It was an impossible situation and finally led to the Act of 1542, popularly known as the Quacks' Charter, which permitted the practice of, and to quote, divers honest persons, as well men as women, whom God hath endowed with the knowledge of the nature, kind, and operation of certain herbs, roots, and waters, and the using and ministering of them to such as be pained with customable disease. Later, it was made clear that such practice was to be conducted without fee, and no doubt this was intended to discourage the deliberate charlatan. It was nevertheless very difficult to separate the wheat from the tares, so that throughout this period the annals of the College of Physicians are filled with accounts of prosecutions of a variety of medical adventurers, the guilty frequently eluding justice by calling the Quacks' Charter to their defense. No one was more active in these prosecutions than Dr. John Keyes, a very influential fellow of the college for almost 30 years, who served his last term as president in 1571, when William Shakespeare was 7 years old. It should be emphasized that this Dr. Keyes can in no way be identified with the comic figure of the same name that was introduced into the Merry Wives of Windsor. Although the physician, that is the bachelor or doctor of medicine, was considered capable of and was legally entitled to carry on all activities related to medicine, he disdained either to compound drugs or to perform surgery, since to do so would have lowered his status. Generally speaking, he concerned himself only with internal medicine. If one had, for example, a fever, he would consult a physician, who, among other procedures, would very likely write a long and complicated prescription to be filled at an apothecary's shop. The apothecaries had already centred themselves around Bucklersbury, near St. Paul's, when Shakespeare and the Merry Wives of Windsor wrote of their shops whose scent in simple time lay heavy on the air. Although the apothecaries had their own guild in London, the Grocers' Company, they were under the supervision of the College of Physicians, which sought to control standards of quality of drugs by periodic investigations of the apothecaries' shops, sometimes burning defective drugs, and was also on the alert to see that the apothecaries did not practice medicine. As William Bullen, a fellow of the College of Physicians, advised in his Book of Compounds, let the apothecary meddle only with his own vocation, and that he do remember his office is only to be the physician's cook. More than one apothecary was fined or even imprisoned for assuring the sick that he would be pleased to attend their ailments for a smaller fee than the physician would charge. For their part, the physicians frequently complained that they went unpaid because the apothecary's charges for drugs had consumed all the patient's money. If one's ailment were a fractured arm, a gangrenous leg, a venereal disease, or a boil, one consulted a surgeon. In London, the surgeons had been reorganized by an Act of 1540 into the United Company of Barber Surgeons, with headquarters in Barber Surgeons' Hall in Monkwell Street. They were an active group, unimpeded by such formalized traditions as encumbered the physicians, and so more enthusiastic for the development of their profession. The surgeons were the first medical organization in England to take up the formal teaching of human anatomy, which became one of the popular spectacles of London and was referred to by Shakespeare's dramatic colleague Webster in The Duchess of Malfi. I will flay off his skin to cover one of the anatomies this rogue hath set in the cold yonder in Barber Surgeons' Hall. There were a few hospitals, but not such as we know them today, and one was wise to avoid them if at all possible. Usually, hospital care was provided only for the aged, destitute, or those who had no friends to look after them. In the provinces, there were a few small hospitals which probably did more harm than good. In London, there were 5, but 3 of them, respectively, a house of correction, a hospital for the insane, and one for orphans, were of such specialized nature and of much less consequence than the 2 larger general hospitals, St. Bartholomew's and St. Thomas's. Each of these had its own medical staff of physicians, surgeons, and nurses, and cared for several hundred patients who had either applied for admission or had been brought in by the hospital's beadles, who patrolled the London streets on watch for what were known as the sick, aged, and impotent. Relative to the times, the care of the patients was not without some merit. It is true that the physicians made ward rounds only once a week, but the patients appear to have been well fed and provided with a quart of beer daily. Normally, there was no charge, but if the patient could pay, the amount was £1 a week. However, if the ailment were venereal, usually syphilis, there was an extra charge of 8d. And according to William Clowes, one of the leading surgeons of that day and associated with St. Bartholomew's, about half the patients suffered from this complaint. In addition to the hospitals, there were also a few pest houses with conveniently attached burial grounds, to which plague victims were sent. The City of London had one in St. Giles, Cripplegate, and Westminster had another at Tottle Fields. Finally, on the fringe of this medical organization were the empirics, some legal and some illegal, the latter irresponsibly employing all the blandishments of quackery to the extent of astrology and even the supposed magic of witchcraft. Then as now, gullibility was not always confined to the lower classes, and some quacks were able to carry on their harmful practices protected against prosecution by powerful patrons. Among the powerful, not the least gullible, was King James I. And although his throne was not a refuge for the usual medical quackery, it was his belief in the existence of witches that led him to appoint a physician, Edward Jordan, to examine a girl brought to London as a declared witch. On the basis of this incident, Dr. Jordan, substituting rationalism for superstition, produced a small book, the first significant English contribution to the study of mental illness, in which he demonstrated that much of what passed for the evils of witchcraft might better be called hysteria. If now we give our attention to some of the major diseases of Shakespeare's day, let it first be said that England of that time, and especially London, was an excellent breeding ground for plague and other communicable diseases. London especially was crowded, and throughout our period, despite ordinances to the contrary, new buildings were erected which added to the congestion, and older buildings were subdivided into increased housing that contributed to the development of tenements. The narrow streets were the depositories of household filth and worse. Sewage systems, if they can be dignified by such a term when they did exist, were open ditches whose running waters were often blocked by ill-suited refuse and so resulted in floods of sewage. It is true that in 1596 Sir John Harrington published his account of the flush toilet with plans for its construction, but even had this worthy contribution to public health been seriously accepted rather than, as was the curious fact, considered unseemly by that bawdy age, it could have had very little effect without proper sewage disposal systems. Among the larger towns of England, the water supply only of London was considered good in the sense of its not being overly polluted. Otherwise, its unpleasantly high mineral content was the same then as now. Many, however, used private sources of water, and given the general lack of sanitary conditions, flare-ups of typhoid fever and dysentery were far from uncommon. Domestic hygiene was not much beyond the level of public health. It is true that soap was available, although expensive, but even among the well-to-do it seems not to have been in common use. One medical writer advised that upon rising, wash your hands and wrists, your face and eyes. That was enough for the day, and it was a rare occasion when the entire body was submerged in a bath. The heating problem led to the more or less continuous wearing of clothes, which were washed only infrequently, since for various reasons, such as the cost of soap and the difficulties of drying in the English climate, laundry remained a problem and appears to have been more for de-infestation than for cleanliness. Clothing and bedding were stored tightly compressed in wardrobes and chests, as a contemporary declared, so that the said fleas are without light and air and kept in prison. Then they will perish and die. There seems little doubt that William Shakespeare's contemporaries were dirty, lousy, and odorous. Of all the diseases with which the physician had to grapple, the most terrifying and the least responsive to his well-meant ministrations was the bubonic plague, which was endemic in England and flared up from time to time with epidemic force. Its relationship to living conditions, as just mentioned, is obvious to us. But to the physician of Shakespeare's day, nothing was known of the plague's mode of transmission, and in consequence some thought it the result of a poisonous effluvium from contaminated soil. This led to various regulations, seldom enforced for long, regarding disposal of refuse and filth that might lead to miasmatic conditions. And it is interesting to note that in 1552, John, the father of William Shakespeare, was fined 12d for not removing the household dirt and filth accumulated before his door. Curiously enough, it was noted that an increase in the rat population seemed a prelude to a plague epidemic, but it was assumed that this was owing to the rats fleeing the poisoned soil, which would in time corrupt the air and so bring on the plague. Some attributed the plague to astrological influences, and still others to divine wrath. These last, including many of the clergy, were a great nuisance, since their fatalistic position was counter to that of the civil authorities, who declared the plague to be contagious, and did take some sensible measures such as quarantine and prohibition against any sort of assembly of the people. The great plague years during William Shakespeare's time were 1568, 1573, 1575, 1578, 1581 and 82, 1592 and 93, and finally there was the very severe epidemic of 1603, which claimed over 30,000 lives in London and led to the somewhat undistinguished coronation of the new King James I. In London, all assemblies were banned when the plague's victims amounted to more than 30 per day, and naturally this affected the theatre. The physicians' plague remedies were valueless, but in any event, such of the city's population as was mobile had no intention of remaining to try them out. Those that could fled to the country, frequently spreading the epidemic in this way, so that such visitors from London were not particularly popular in the countryside. When Queen Elizabeth had herself fled to Windsor on one occasion, she caused a gallows to be set up in the marketplace to hang all those that should come there from London. If we can credit the account of Thomas Lodge, erstwhile dramatist turned physician, at least during the epidemic of 1603, the London physicians were as swift as any in their flight, and so left the city's charlatans a clear field in which to reap a harvest from the terrified populace. Two further diseases of epidemic character were malaria and syphilis. The first great European pandemic of malaria occurred shortly after the middle of the 16th century, probably as a result of the wide extension of maritime trade and the more or less permanent contacts with the oldest and worst centers of the disease in Africa and Asia. Thereafter, malaria was endemic in Britain, and it was no peculiar accident that some of the 17th century classics on the subject were written in England, and that both James I and Cromwell died of malaria, which remained a constant threat to rural England and even to London up to the 19th century. It has already been said that half the patients in the great London hospitals suffered from syphilis, and although they were mostly from the lowest social and economic levels of society, nevertheless the disease was widespread through all classes. It had, however, lost that virulence with which it had seized its victims when it first appeared at the close of the 15th century, but it was still capable of producing in time all the horrible results which fortunately can now, for the most part, be prevented. The effects of the disease were summed up in a graphic passage in Timon of Athens, and John Donne, like Shakespeare, noted its tendency to affect the nose. A pox upon you was a malediction with genuine meaning in that age. If the great pox took longer to kill its victims at the close of the 16th century, the smallpox was only beginning to assert its full strength at that time, and it was not until the 17th century that dread of smallpox began to resemble the fear hitherto confined to epidemics of the plague. Typhus or jail fever was sporadically and locally lethal, as were measles, whooping cough, and diphtheria. And tuberculosis, known as Typhus or the wasting disease, took its numerous victims, among them, about a decade before Shakespeare was born, King Edward VI. All these ailments were constant reminders of man's mortality, but the state of medicine was such that it could do little for the sufferers. Scrofula, or tuberculosis of the lymphatic glands, was a widespread disease of peculiar significance, since its cure was attributed to the monarch's touch, traditionally considered as a power first granted to and exercised by Edward the Confessor in the 11th century. During Elizabeth's reign, the procedure was for the Queen to appoint a special day for touching, frequently a Sunday. The sufferers assembled and were examined by the royal medical staff to prevent imposture and to see that the more revolting ulcers and suppurations were covered. After a religious service, at which one of the royal chaplains read St. Mark's words, "He shall lay hands upon the sick and they shall recover," the scrofulous, sometimes 50 or more at a time, filed past the seated Queen, who laid her hands on the actual site of the disease and at the same time declared, "I touch thee and God heals thee." James I considered the royal touch as no more than a superstitious practice. But when it was explained to him that this evidence of association between royalty and divinity was a prop for his none too secure throne, prudence triumphed, and the canny Scot agreed to play the part of royal healer. Whatever the medical profession may have thought of its own ability, it was in fact powerless to help the victims of epidemics and communicable diseases such as those that have been mentioned, and a great variety of other ailments as well. According to current theory, health depended upon a normal balance of the so-called four humours of the body. These were blood, which was also the vehicle for the other three: black bile, yellow bile or choler, and phlegm. Disease, whatever the factor promoting it, was essentially an upset of the balance of these humours, which must be restored for the recovery of health. The balance might be destroyed by overeating, overexertion, sudden chill, or the introduction into the body of whatever it was that produced plague, smallpox, or any of the other diseases so common at the time. Although health was considered to be dependent upon the humoral balance, within the limits of that balance, one of the humours was recognized as having a predominant influence upon the individual, and this produced his temperament. As everything in the world was based upon the four elements of fire, air, earth, and water, so each humour contained one of these elements. Hence, if the influencing humour were black bile, and since its elemental component was earth, the individual's temperament was cold and dry, the melancholy type. If blood were predominant, he was of a sanguine temperament and considered to be a hot and dry type. The temperament had to be taken into account in illness, since it might be disturbed by severe upset of the humoral balance, and it was a serious matter if a sanguine temperament became phlegmatic, or a melancholic one choleric. The physician's first object then was diagnosis, which meant not merely an attempt to recognize from external signs a disease which we might call smallpox, measles, or plague, but it was also necessary for him to take into account the humoral imbalance which had resulted, and to recognize the true temperament of the patient, and to determine if that temperament had been radically altered. Certain things might be fairly obvious, such as the appearance of a bubo, a swollen inflamed mass of lymphatic glands in the groin or armpit, frequently to be found in plague victims. The appearance of smallpox could be fairly well distinguished from measles by the end of the 16th century, and a few other diseases could usually be identified by their external signs. The physician, however, was primarily interested in the restoration of the balance of the humours, and his treatment was to that end. Thus, the excess of humour must be removed. But which humour? A sanguine temperament was accompanied by fleshiness, a full head of hair, frequently red, perfect digestion, heavy sleep, a tendency to nosebleed. Obviously, then, if the patient lost weight, if his digestion failed, if he were wakeful, there was reason to believe that his temperament had been upset, possibly by the ascendancy of black bile or melancholy. Of course, something could be learned from the respiration and pulse and from the recurrence and duration of fevers, but truly scientific diagnosis required an examination of the patient's urine, which was considered to be the filtered overflow of the blood. Hence, uroscopy, or casting of the waters, was an index to the composition and purity of the blood. And since the blood was also the vehicle of the other humours, such examination would provide information on the all-important matter of the degree of humoral imbalance. The normal procedure was for dispatch of the patient's urine to the physician's residence at dawn. There it was put into a graduated flask, usually of 4 main divisions corresponding to the head, chest, abdomen, and urogenital organs. If, for example, sediment were observed to be falling from the uppermost level downwards to the next, this was thought to indicate phlegm forming in the brain and flowing down into the chest, possibly as a bronchial catarrh. Furthermore, the colour of the urine was considered to be of a great diagnostic value, and much labour went into the preparation of a urinary spectrum for matching purposes. Colour and sedimentary changes were held to be the most reliable indications for diagnosis and prognosis, although it was recognized that practical jokers might occasionally interfere with the course of science. Thus, in the Urinal of Physic, written by Robert Record in 1559 and republished as late as the middle 17th century, there is a caution that one should not mock and jest with any physician, as some light wits do, tempting them with beast's stale instead of man's urine, and much other foul things. Having determined upon a diagnosis, the physician would then prognosticate the patient's fate and undertake treatment. The fatal termination of some ailments could be readily prognosticated by anyone acquainted with the Hippocratic texts, and the correct prognosis in other diseases had been acquired empirically by the medical profession. The influence of the planets was a factor, too, which many heeded, since each planet had its temperament, so that its position at the time of crisis in the disease of a patient of like temperament was important. Some more rational physicians discounted astrology, such as Rabelais, a continental physician, who a little earlier had remarked that in fever it is better to observe the pulse than the grouping of the stars. But in England, many reputable physicians were not so sure that these astral bodies could be wholly ignored. Nevertheless, if superstition were discounted, it was impossible to deny the teaching that God had set in advance the hour of death for every man, so that, as one physician with a fine disregard of double negatives wrote, "No man by no art or science cannot prolong the time, for the number of months and days of man's life God knoweth only." The answer to this, however, was that no one was in a position to read the mind of the deity, and hence the physician was always bound to do his best to preserve life, no matter how desperate the situation might appear to be. Something has already been said of the purpose of treatment, the restoration of the humoral balance. Now let us consider the methods employed to achieve that purpose. Essentially, the removal of the excess humor, or sometimes preventive measures seeking to avoid the development of such excess. Drugs, the herbal remedies, were of the first importance, but to a considerable degree as fearsome purges, since it was believed that by such procedure excess humor would be expelled from the body through a combination of concoction, which we might call the collection and digestion, of this peccant matter, and thereafter its forced rout. The well-to-do classes of England were heavy meat-eaters, but tended to shun both vegetables and fruits as promoting wind and colic, and it has been declared that this tends to explain that state of constipation which was almost a class symbol, and which was also believed to promote excess humour as well as discomfort. In consequence, purging remedies were in constant demand, as well as the gruesome clyster or enema. Physicians sensibly advised a moderate food intake, although it appears that they were little heeded by their patients. A current jingle suggested that a king that cannot rule him in his diet will hardly rule his realm in peace and quiet. And it was pointed out elsewhere that the preparation of the food was also of importance. A good cook is already half of a physician. Those of lower economic status were naturally spared some of the ills of the well-to-do. But it has been remarked that after the restricted diet of the winter months, much of the population of England was in a pre-scorbutic state, and dietary deficiency, coupled with poor climatic conditions, led to what were later considered to be epidemics of rickets, which dared even to claim Charles I for one of its own. The agonies of gout were widespread among the upper classes, which could better afford the diet that aggravated the condition of those predisposed towards this painful affliction. The most celebrated case in England at this time was that of the great Lord Burleigh, Chief Minister of State, but from time to time reduced to inactivity as the uric acid level of his blood rose and announced that fact to his gouty joints. His suffering was so well known that he was constantly bombarded with prescriptions from both reputable physicians and quacks who appreciated the favour to be gained by anyone who might happily alleviate the powerful minister's sufferings. Colchicum, the one effective remedy, which had been known in late classical and medieval times, by now had come to be looked upon as a harmful drug, and its beneficial properties were not recognized again until 200 years later. In addition to their purging force, the herbal remedies were also used to combat disease directly, and many of them were thought to be specifics. It had long been believed on the authority of Aristotle, reinforced by the more sophisticated and complex doctrine of Galen, that each substance had its opposite in terms of qualities. As certain ailments were considered essentially hot, so certain medicaments were thought to be cold and therefore desirable as nullifying agents. All physicians were fully acquainted with long lists of drugs indicating the qualities they possessed, so that very complicated prescriptions might be prepared with herbs to combat whatever the qualities of the disease and the normal or abnormal temperament of the patient, with various further ingredients considered to be emollients and restoratives. Towards the end of the period under consideration, the most popular physician in England was Sir Theodore Mayerne, who had introduced calomel into practice incidentally, but who could manage to compound an herbal remedy of up to 100 ingredients, each one alleged to have its special purpose. Near the close of the 16th century, the Paracelsian doctrine of therapy began to make its way into England, but it was not of any special influence until after the Shakespearean period, so that the use of the more dangerous inorganic substances, except for mercury, lies outside our story. Another therapeutic procedure widely used was bloodletting, or venesection, which represented the direct issue of a certain quantity of blood, which it was hoped would carry off with it whatever the humoral superfluity. In consequence, there came to be elaborate rules as to which vein was to be opened according to the disease diagnosed, and how much blood was to be allowed to escape. Here, too, astral signs were often consulted as to the time for bloodletting, a procedure which was also used as a preventive measure. In particular, those of a sanguine temperament were thought to require the letting of blood periodically. Suffice it to say that more than one patient ended his days as the result of the physician's over-enthusiastic use of this form of therapy. In 1612, during the final illness, probably typhoid fever, of Prince Henry, eldest son of James I, the unfortunate prince was bled with such vigour by the great Dr. Mayerne that finally, when that physician proposed further use of the procedure, some of the assisting physicians objected to the continuance of such potential exsanguination. Incidentally, an estimate of the level of medicine, more particularly therapy, can be gained from the fact that as these royal physicians, presumably the cream of the College of Physicians, realized the near death of the prince, they ordered a cock to be cut in two and the halves applied to the soles of his feet. Despite this, the patient died. A less radical version of bloodletting was the use of the cupping glass, or leeches, which drew off a smaller quantity of blood. These procedures for bleeding, since they were mechanical actions, were usually carried out by surgeons under the direction of the physician. The patient, of course, had 2 bills to pay. The surgeon was also employed to produce counter-irritation mechanically, and so through a chronic inflammatory reaction to drain off an excess humour by inducing a running sore. This might be achieved by a poultice containing powdered cantharides or powdered mustard to evoke blisters, or by actual cautery, the application of a heated metal instrument to the skin, or potential cautery, the application of caustic materials such as lye. Among their major procedures, the better surgeons had become fairly adept at rapid amputation, their skill usually acquired during military service. And by now they had at their command a variety of prosthetic devices which remained essentially little changed until the 20th century. They had some acquaintance with head injuries, and occasionally a surgeon displayed some understanding of the accompanying neurological signs. Lithotomy was practiced, and by the latter part of our period, the surgeons were treating syphilis with mercury, although sometimes with disastrous overtreatment. Surgeons such as William Clowes were a credit to their profession, although it was necessary for the Barber Surgeons' Company to be constantly on watch against quacks, such as carpenters and metalsmiths, who thought to use their mechanical skills for alteration and reconstruction of the human body. It was gross ignorance of true surgical skill that resulted in the death of Sir Martin Frobisher in 1594, after he'd been only slightly wounded by a musket ball. Earlier on, it was remarked that William Shakespeare's relatively long life, which in fact we are celebrating, was probably the result of fortune and native constitution. And this has in some measure been illustrated by what has been said of disease and medicine in England during his lifetime. It is clear that diagnosis and prognosis were slightly in advance of the Hippocratic practices of 2,000 years earlier, but in some respects therapy was inferior, owing to the acceptance of the complexities which Galen had introduced into the earlier but more rational Hippocratic treatment. On the other hand, the techniques of surgery had improved considerably during the course of the 16th century, at least in the practice of some. In the year of William Shakespeare's death, the physician to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, named William Harvey, was appointed to give the anatomical lectures to the College of Physicians. 3 years later, in the course of these Lumleian lectures, he made some remarkable proposals regarding the heart and the movement of blood throughout the body, ideas which would eventually bring about radical changes in medicine. But all of this belongs to a later time. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Did anyone get out of the hospitals that were situated near the cemeteries at the time of the plague? Get out alive, I mean.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, of course. Everyone didn't die for a play.
Do you know the proportion?
No, not all men.
Can you tell me what the average lifespan was at the time?
Not precisely. The average was life expectancy, I suppose, was in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 years, somewhere in there. 50, 52, as in the case of Shakespeare, was old age.
What were the practices in the way of anesthesia during this period?
You bit the bullet. That was about it. Alcohol and nothing else. That's why amputations were performed so quickly.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Malley.
Our Next week, our speaker will be talking on the subject of Shakespeare himself, in particular, Shakespeare's tragedy. And he'll offer some views on the meaning of the meaning of his tragedy in terms of theater or meta-theater. This will serve, I hope, as a transition to the symposium on Shakespeare and his work, which will be held the following week, 2 weeks from tonight, in the McGowan Playhouse. Until next week, then, when we will hear from Professor Hugh Gray of the Department of Theater Arts, good night.